Class is finally in session. I know this is something that a lot of you have been waiting for, so here it finally is. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about or are surprised to find that people look to me as some sort of, not expert, but guy who is good at arguments, well, to you I say, doesn't matter. This series isn't going to be titled Philosophy from Authority, it is Philosophy from Intuition. So listen up, class, because I'm about to expose myself in front of all of you. That is a terrible way of mixing metaphors. I'm about to reveal a personal part of myself? No, that's not any better. Fact is, I have virtually no formal education on philosophy. I never took it in college. And hopefully that doesn't discourage you from continuing to watch this video. Because if you think I need to be an authority on something like logic, then that means you defer to the authority of logisticians, and appeal to authority is a fallacy according to those same academics. So I'm not sure how that irony would be lost on you. But that's beside the point. I just want to be transparent because I'm going to use very technical terminology and very casual terminology interchangeably. I'll try to make it clear which is which so you can know what is like textbook versus just common sense. But at the same rate, I'm not really going to be the kind of guy to help you get through Philosophy 101. I'm just a guy who will hopefully provide some thought-provoking videos. Or am I? Cue Vsauce theme song. Sorry, I just didn't have a very good segue for that because I don't want to talk about myself at length. But I think it's fair to answer a question as proposed. People ask me, how did you learn that? How do I debate like you? So why am I like this? People angrily shout that at me all the time, so it must be a very important question. And I think the long and short of it is this. As a child, I was mostly left to my own devices. So I imagine if my dad is watching this, he's likely shouting at the screen trying to take all the credit for himself. See, he would just do this very, very annoying thing where no matter if he agreed with me, he would always hold the position opposite to the one I had stated, so that way I would actually have to explain my beliefs thoroughly. So like, you know that experiment that the Unabomber was in, where they would just bully him and say that everything he believed was wrong, and people think maybe that's what made him crazy? Yeah, that was my childhood. I think my story is one of a man who was made to be self-taught. Obviously, what my father did is a lot like the Socratic method, which is a teaching method that makes someone find answers through self-discovery. But unfortunately, I can't just sit here like Dora the Explorer. What do you think makes someone good at debate? Very good! But I promise you this tangent hasn't been in vain. We can still work through it together, especially since, although not quite satisfying, I've already given you the answer. So let's see if we can walk through it and discover it a bit more naturally. So what is debate? I know it's cliche to just throw what is before something and then call that a philosophy lecture. Is it about tricking people into agreeing with you? Certainly that is one way of viewing it. Persuasion and rhetoric are important parts of debate that we'll get to in due time, but exactly as I phrased it, tricking people, is that debate? Maybe making no assumptions here at the beginning, we haven't really given ourselves room to reject this idea. Which is fine for now. I want to make this series very self-contained. However, an issue I have with, let's call them existentialists, is that in conceding that we should make no assumptions, aren't we making an assumption? We are assuming that we should make no assumptions. And you can call me obstinate, but if everything needs a concrete explanation from the ground up, then what is the explanation that everything needs to be concretely explained without making an assumption? The answer is, there is none. This belief is completely unfounded and will always lead to self-contradiction. Now, obviously, there are probably resolutions to this by modifying the statement, but we're jumping ahead of ourselves getting into epistemology when we don't even understand debate. So maybe I can't give an argument from the ground up about why we shouldn't trick people into agreeing with us, but it's definitely not something that I want to do. If I trick someone into believing something, but I'm wrong, sure, I'm tricking them, but I'm also tricking myself. And also, if you know that you're wrong, then that's not called debate, that's called lying. Clearly, debate has some obligation to the truth, or at the very least, honest opinion. And at the risk of stating the obvious, if debate isn't about tricking people, it's about providing them with the truth, then debate is simply a conversation. It is you explaining that which you understand. You are just conveying an idea to someone using some means of communication. So, food for thought, if your debate skills need work, then either you can't explain that which you understand, or, more controversially, you don't understand that which you are trying to explain. Now, continuing on, however, unfortunately this definition we've arrived at already needs revision. If debate is talking down to someone, then sure, we've nailed it. But obviously, debate isn't just lecturing. Imagine if you went everywhere just telling everyone what you think. Yeah, that's great for you, but What incentive is there for everyone else to not just do the same? And if that was the case, how would you ever have a productive conversation? You would speak your piece, the other person would do the same, but neither of you would really listen. Nothing would be accomplished. Both parties would walk away unchanged. So, love it or hate it, debate involves vulnerability. It involves not only explaining, but listening and allowing there to be some standard by which you would concede that you are wrong, because otherwise no one would have any incentive to concede their view in favor of yours. Debate is using concepts we agree upon to prove concepts that we do not agree upon. This is the principle of debate. These concepts we agree upon are called premises, and our conclusions are, well, conclusions. I know this sounds very simple and like I've wasted your time, but I promise you we're covering this in such great detail because besides a few concepts that we'll add in the next video, this is it. This is technically all that you need to know. The rest of this series will just be the logical implications of this. It's just a matter of understanding it as opposed to simply knowing it as a point of fact. For example, this principle as it is raises the question, what if someone's intent isn't to be vulnerable and give themselves to the process? Well, that's called bad faith. They are violating the spirit of debate. And this can be done, as I said, by being unwilling to concede to the results of a fair transaction, or other examples of duplicity or perfidy involve misrepresentation, claiming to hold unreasonable premises, or rejecting reasonable ones with the sole intent of sabotaging the outcome of the debate. For example, if your argument requires me to believe that the Earth is round to yield your conclusion, but instead of just accepting that you're right, I ask you instead to prove that the Earth is round, and maybe I state that I don't believe the Earth is round, then I'm just being a sore loser because obviously I think the Earth is round. This is bad faith. Good or bad faith aren't necessarily derived from the content of this principle that we've created. It instead exists as a violation of the goal of this principle of debate. So that means anything from lying, obfuscating, to insulting people may fall under the umbrella of bad faith. I say may because there's a lot of nuance here. Obviously, anytime someone discusses something complex, that can't just be written off as obfuscation. And a murder trial cannot be said to be unfair simply because a man is being condemned with statements that attack his character. So likewise, insults or any language you find offensive is only bad faith if the intent is to disrupt debate. Just as the murderer is a murderer if proven to be a murderer, if you're an idiot, then you're an idiot. This all probably deserves a video in its own right, as any concept with intent not only becomes difficult to prove, but also this specifically is hard to find a happy middle ground between the openness of trusting someone, being polite, and the realness of keeping some of your guard up, calling a spade, and not just forfeiting your beliefs without reason, because that's the whole point. Perhaps a bit more straightforward is the structural violations that we can run into in debate. If in a debate we use that which we agree upon, then if you don't provide something we agree upon, there's no debate. A missing, contentious, or repeated premise is probably the simplest mistake there is in a debate. Take, for example, begging the question. This is when you repeat your premise in some way as your conclusion. A textbook example of begging the question is green is the best color because it's the greenest of all colors. If you're familiar with the idiom that either derived its name from or gave its name to this fallacy, this statement begs the question. Why is green the best color? Because that is the very question that statement originally sought to answer. As you can see, this represents a more generalized problem. Here we say A because A, but we can just as easily introduce a middleman that seemingly makes our argument valid, A because B. But what is our defense of B? Well, if it's B because A, then we have a problem. We have A because B because A, which is just A because A with more steps. Or likewise, you can just think of it as a never-ending circle, hence its name, circular reasoning. One of the most intuitive fallacies. Asterisks. I hate it when people teach you something wrong on purpose, like all throughout school where you're taught you can't divide by zero, and then you get into calculus and they're just like, actually that's all we're gonna do here. So this is just something I'm going to brush over until maybe we come back to it in more detail, like I said, if we ever come back to epistemology. Yes, circular reasoning violates our principle of debate and as such is labeled a fallacy, so much so that anytime you look it up, pretty much every academic says that it's a fallacy without giving it a second thought. But think about it. If I say that I am sitting right here, because I am right here, sitting, Is that not true? And obviously this won't be a fair question if you don't know because we haven't gone over logical structure yet, but is that argument invalid? It certainly is if we assume that circular reasoning is a fallacy, but here's the beautiful irony in this little tangent we've gone on. Isn't that the thing we're trying to prove? That circular reasoning is a fallacy. So how can we rely on the assumption that circular reasoning is a fallacy in order to prove that it is? Because that's circular reasoning. So by definition, it is not a fallacy, which is something you'll see pop up in deeper conversations and actually ties back to what we were saying earlier about assumptions. We're going to need a tally system every time I say we're going to talk about this in epistemology, because we will. Essentially, if you don't think truth can be found in assumptions, the only other side of this extreme is believing that truth needs to be discovered as a whole through a system of self-referential statements. Or, in other words, a consonant system of beliefs that imply one another, much like how each puzzle in a set complement each other and represent some bigger picture. But for now, just know that circular reasoning doesn't make something wrong or invalid, it just makes it not convincing, which for the sake of debate makes it a bad argument. And if that sounds like I'm drawing a distinction between truth and debate, sorry. The alternative is just there not being a discussion. Because if you think that circular arguments should be valid in debate, what are you going to do? Convince someone of your conclusion by just repeating it over and over again? Like, oh yeah, the first time you said that I didn't agree with you, but now that you've just said it over and over again, I completely agree. We need a starting point and we can figure the truth out later. Otherwise we'll be stuck in a never-ending chain of disagreement. But I think that's enough talking about the structure of an argument. We spent so much time talking about premises, but that's because there's basically nothing else. Like, I'm not sure what a debate would be if someone constructed an argument that had a premise but lacked a conclusion. I think that's just called talking. And if you guys think I'm going to be able to teach you how to talk to people, that's a better joke than any of the crap that I wrote down. Likewise, a statement without a conclusion or an argument is just a statement of fact, or at the very least, just a widely accepted statement. So moving on from the structure of an argument, that leaves only sort of the context of the argument. These sort of contextual failures are when an argument isn't missing or having any sort of issue with a premise or conclusion, it is instead the cohesiveness between the two, the actual body of the argument itself. To name a few clear issues we can run into, if you think of reaching a conclusion from a premise like crossing a bridge between two ledges, well, what if we're simply missing the bridge? The sky is blue because I hate eating oranges. Where's the argument there? Beats me! Whether or not we say that there is or is not an argument there, it's clear that the conclusion doesn't logically follow the premise. The name for that is, it does not follow. But in Latin, so non sequitur. In addition to that, when we start stringing together multiple premises to reach our conclusion, we can find them to be faulty in some way. One way being that even if the premises are true or agreed upon, they may be compiled in a misleading manner. The outside of a tree is bark. Bark is the noise a dog makes. Therefore, the outside of a tree is comprised of sound waves made by a dog. Both premises are true, there's nothing wrong with the structure of the argument. The issue is that bark and bark mean different things. This is called equivocation and causes a disconnect between the premise and the conclusion. But unfortunately, or fortunately if you're tired of listening to me, this video has dragged on for quite a long time, so this is where it's going to come to an end. Because to tie everything we've discussed into a neat little bow, debate isn't something you can learn in a day. It's something that can take a lifetime, and it's not even really something I can teach you because it's not any one thing. It is understanding these things. It is the creation and dissemination of ideas. So by necessity, it itself is the very act of understanding, which, when presented as a field of study, we call philosophy. We can't go further into this without addressing the relationship between premises and conclusions, in other words, proof. What does it mean to prove something? Can we rely on assumptions? Can we build from the ground up, or are we doomed to chase our tail in circles every time we try? I would imagine there have to be some standards by which you can prove something, anything, because if there were not, then you would not be able to prove that you cannot prove things. So what can we prove, and what are the standards of proof? That is a question, hopefully, we'll be able to address in the next video.